Hello again, everybody. Welcome to our third episode of The App. This is our new podcast offering from KTBS. The App, in this case, stands for Arklatex People in Politics. Has absolutely nothing to do with computers. But remember that, the app, file that away for future use. Arklatex People in Politics. First two shows have been gangbusters. We had Speaker of the House Mike Johnson on show number 1. And then show number 2 featured syndicated radio host Moon Griffon, along with State Senator Alan Seabaugh and State Representative Dodie Horton. That was quite a lively conversation. We anticipate another one today. We're going to take a look at politics from slightly different angles. Let me introduce our two guests today. In the upper box there that you're looking at, that is Melinda DeLotte from the Public Affairs Research Council. And down below is Barry Irwin for, I want to say Cable or Council for a Better Louisiana, but it's Leaders for a Better Louisiana, right, Barry?
That's it. New name.
And we'll talk about that. Yeah, we'll talk about that more in a second. But you guys have such incredible backgrounds, and I want you to just explain them a little bit before we get started with talking about various topics here. But Melinda, explain your background before you went to work with PAR.
Sure. Thank you for having us today. So I was a longtime reporter covering politics at the state capitol. So I worked for the Associated Press for more than 22 years, and almost all of that was in Louisiana at the state capitol. So I've been around covering politics here since 2000.
Well, we're going to ask you about some of your experiences covering politics, and I have an AP question for you as well. I think you know where I'm going with that. And then,
Figured.
Yeah, before I ask you that, let's go to Barry. And Barry, talk about your background. You were a broadcaster, right?
Yes, I was actually in Shreveport for one of your competitive stations. Did that for a while, then came to Baton Rouge and worked at WBRZ here for a number of years. I guess probably about 15 years total between the two markets. And like Melinda, I covered a lot of state politics, legislature, government, all of those types of things. So,
well, tell us.
Moved into others.
Yeah, tell us about first Council for a Better Louisiana, and then Leaders for a Better Louisiana. What is the purpose of this group?
Well, Cable was formed back in 1962. It's kind of a good government group, kind of in the likeness of PAR, which had been around earlier. But we do advocacy and did for all those years governmental advocacy. Really is in a nonpartisan way, trying to focus on issues for us historically have been, kind of broadly speaking, things around economic development, but really a focus on, education at all levels, government accountability, governmental ethics, things like infrastructure, and then, other issues as they arise after Katrina with, COVID, all those different things come up. But, a nonpartisan group trying to, hopefully develop and help push for policies that improve our state.
And you just recently merged with Committee of 100, right?
Yeah, I keep forgetting that. I still say Cable everywhere, and I take my thing out of the closet, and I got all these little Cable pins on there. So forgive me for that. But yeah, we had worked closely actually with PAR and Committee of 100 quite a bit over the last 2 election cycles on a project called Reset Louisiana. And basically, I think we're all kind of like-minded groups in many ways. And I think because our groups have been working together, periodically the leaderships come together and think, maybe, you got to think about merging or combining or collaborating in a more formal way. And we've had those conversations in the past, but this time it actually happened. So our board and the board of the Committee of 100 for Economic Development basically spent the last year meeting and kind of working through all the legal, technical, and operational, organizational things to bring our organizations together. And so that's what happened. Our formal merger went through at the beginning of the year, just in January. So we are now Leaders for a Better Louisiana, but we're not labeled like we were Cable. Our shorthand is just Better Louisiana. So don't call us label.
Better for Louisiana. I got you. All right. And Melinda, tell us about PAR too. What your group does, and kind of in comparison to, I guess, what Barry was talking about.
Sure. So my title at PAR is Research Director. And essentially what PAR does is we have been around since 1950. So this is our 75th anniversary year,
Oh.
which is a big deal for us. But we are a nonpartisan government watchdog group, essentially sort of a think tank. One of our primary focuses is open meetings and public records law, essentially sunshine in government, having people understand what happens in their government, understand the actions of their elected officials. We're very big on transparency, obviously, and don't support efforts to sort of close off government from people. We do spend a lot of time focusing on issues like we track the budget at the Capitol. We are engaged in education issues. And then we do a lot of other things. We have a monthly webinar series on public policy issues where we try to educate the public about ongoing topics of statewide interest. We just did one in which Barry was a guest, where we went through all the constitutional amendments that'll be on the March 29th ballot. And that is probably, if people come into contact with PAR and they're not around the Capitol, the thing that we are most known for is we put out a nonpartisan guide to the constitutional amendments every year that there are constitutional amendments on the ballot. And so, we don't tell people how to vote. We just explain what the amendment does, what supporters say about it, what opponents say about it, and let everybody make their own informed opinion. But we do try to educate the public and provide a lot of research on issues of interest in the public policy arena.
All good stuff. We'll talk about a big amendment coming up on the March 29th ballot here. But I did want to ask you that AP question, and you know what I'm getting at here, and that's the Associated Press being banned now from the White House press room. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, I'm still a supporter of the Associated Press. I think that there are a lot of people doing really good work there, trying to inform the public. I think retaliating against any news organization because you don't like decisions that they make is at least violating the spirit of the First Amendment in my mind. But I'll also say, it's just a real slippery slope. Even if people don't like the reporting of a specific outlet, banning one outlet by a Republican president who doesn't like it, you can play through the reverse. What happens when there's a Democratic president in the future and they ban, they might be interested in banning somebody, a news outlet that they don't support the perspective of either. So it's just, to me, it's a problematic area to get into. I support the First Amendment and I support the public access that is allowed to journalists, including with the Associated Press and including, reporters across the political perspective.
Yeah, I figured that would be your position. Barry, I assume you have kind of the same position.
Oh, certainly. I mean, my background was in journalism as well, and I can't say it better than Melinda did. I mean, it's just, we're in kind of interesting times, and I think we just have to be kind of careful what we see happening with a lot of our institutions, particularly the media.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Baton Rouge. Let's review just a little bit before we plunge ahead. And of course, last fall, the legislature had the special session on taxes. They seemed to accomplish quite a bit. Barry, what are your thoughts on the things that went on last fall?
Well, I mean, I think it was a really big deal. And, there was a lot of talk earlier in the year and almost through the beginning of the summer about a constitutional convention that the governor wanted to do. There never was enough legislative appetite to do that. But, one of the things that was kind of driving that desire for a constitutional convention was to go in and make some changes in the big article of our Constitution that deals with tax and finance at both the state and the local level, and to do some other things on taxes. And so that's kind of what that special session did. It really was kind of two parts in some ways. I mean, really, you can add another one when you talk about the other amendments that we're going to talk about besides the fiscal ones. But it really did a couple of things on the fiscal side. It made some significant changes in tax policy for our income tax, for the corporate income and franchise tax, and sales tax that are not dependent on the passage of this amendment. They were passed to create a flat tax for the income tax and reduce the amount that most people are paying in income tax, get rid of the corporate franchise tax, lower the corporate income tax, and then make up for that loss of revenue to some degree by increasing the sales tax. So those are tax changes that happened during that session, and they are being implemented now. But they also passed this large amendment that we're going to talk about to rewrite that entire Article 7 of the Constitution dealing with, again, state and local fiscal and tax policy. And that was a very big thing, too. So it wasn't a constitutional convention in that sense, but it did attack one of the areas that a lot of constitutional reformers wanted to get at, and that was that particular article that we'll be voting on in March 29th.
And Melinda, Barry mentioned Article 7. That's where much of this is tax reform is tied up into. And there's been a group, I guess, now down in the New Orleans area that has decided they don't even want that amendment to appear on the ballot. They've filed a lawsuit to try and stop that. You have thoughts on that lawsuit?
Well, I mean, I'll start with I'm not a lawyer,
Right,
so
of course.
I feel like that's always where I should start when we get into those kind of legal questions. I mean, look, the lawsuit is about whether or not the ballot language meets the requirements in the Constitution and gives voters a full explanation of what is contained in that amendment. What I will say is the Constitution has a provision that allows the legislature to rewrite an entire article, which is what they have done with this particular amendment. I'm not going to even wade into whether I think there is legal standing or a solid legal argument about, about the ballot language. What I will say is, we were pretty explicit in our guide that the ballot language does not necessarily express like the full breadth and depth of what is in this amendment. But I will say that is really hard to do. It's a 115-page amendment, and then there are 4 or 5 companion bills that go along with that amendment to further flesh out, what happens with the provisions that get changed. So it is really difficult to try and explain that in one paragraph on a screen for voters. And I think anybody who is working on trying to do that would have struggled with the task. I think the question at hand is whether or not the legislature only highlighted the things they thought voters would like in that amendment as opposed to fully explaining it. And that's for a court to decide if they did a good enough job of accurately reflecting what that 115-page bill really does.
Well, I can tell you that I talked to the Attorney General just a couple of days ago. She didn't seem too concerned by that suit. She didn't think it was going to, that the amendment was going to definitely appear on the ballot. Barry, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, pretty much the same thing. I mean, I think that went through a few iterations before it got to the final ballot language that we saw. And they were all very, very positive, reflections of what's in that amendment. So, I think, I don't know if this has solved any problems, but I think the first ones were really, really positive views of that amendment.
Go ahead, Melinda.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, look, there's a challenge in that you have to fit the ballot language on a voting screen. So there's that. But Barry is right. Perhaps where it started in earlier iterations was, it had far less detail and was far more glowing about what the amendment outcome would be. So we'll see. I'll tell everybody, PAR has a lovely guide that goes into 20 pages of detail about what's in that amendment too, if you actually want to know what's in the ins and outs of it. But hopefully we'll know the outcome of that litigation soon. So, March 29th is approaching soon enough. So I think people would like to know if that's going to be on the ballot or not.
Yeah.
Particularly the governor.
Don't you think, though, that when you talk about the language on this particular amendment, that's the problem with all these amendments that they try to do. No one can really understand what the heck they're talking about. Barry, what do you think? Am I right or wrong about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a perennial issue. Usually, I mean, look, this is the longest one people have probably ever seen, and I'm just talking about the ballot language.
Right.
It's pretty hefty just there. But usually what you get is a couple of sentences or maybe, a paragraph that with some of these things are so complicated. I mean, we just had one last year, the one that Melinda and I both love, dealing with tax sales. And like, you could read that and not have a clue what they were talking about. I mean, nobody, and it's not because voters aren't smart, it's because voters are not exposed to some of these types of issues, and the ballot language is just, inadequate to explain it. So it's what we tell people, and certainly PAR as well, is really, if you're interested in these things, you really have to do your homework, and you have to kind of look behind the curtain, because you can't really figure this out on most of these things just from the ballot language.
Well, Melinda,
I've already blocked out the tax sale amendment. I don't even remember what it does, and I literally wrote about it.
well, tell us about the other amendments that we might might be interested in on the upcoming ballot then.
So there are three other amendments on the March 29th ballot, all of them dealing with the courts and the criminal system, essentially. One of them, well, and judgeships. So the First Amendment would actually, it would explicitly spell out in the Constitution that the Supreme Court has the authority to discipline out-of-state lawyers, which they already outline that authority in the rules of conduct for attorneys in the state, but this would just put it in the Constitution. But perhaps the bigger thing this amendment does is, and the thing that the legislature spent a lot of debate on, is it would expand the ability to create specialty courts around the state. Currently, you can only have, things like drug courts, behavioral health courts that are specialized to deal with people with specific criteria or types of crimes. You can only have them in parishes or judicial districts. You have to stay within those boundaries. Amendment 1 would let the legislature in the future create statewide specialty courts or regional specialty courts. And there was a lot of debate about, what was the intention of it. Some of the supporters said they were interested in a statewide business court. I think a lot of people just had a lot of questions of what's wrong with the existing system. Do we need to create, new paths for specialty courts, and what does that mean? So I think we'll find out later sort of what kind of courts people might be interested in if this amendment passes. I would say the Third Amendment also got a lot of attention. It involves juvenile crime. We have a list of 16 delineated crimes that are in the Constitution where people under the age of 17 can be charged as adults in the criminal justice system. So it's things like first-degree murder, second-degree murder, first-degree rape, some kidnapping charges, and other things. They're all very serious felony crimes for which, people like under the age of 17 can be charged as adults. What the legislature is proposing to do, if voters approve it, is remove that list and give the legislature the ability to more easily add more felony crimes to that list, so that teenagers between the ages of 14 and 16 could be tried as adults for certain crimes. And then the final one is a very technical amendment. It's Amendment 4. Because we are going to a closed primary system next year for certain offices, including Supreme Court justices, the way they pass the closed primary law, it could create additional elections beyond the current system. Right now, somebody gets, you have an open primary, everybody runs against each other. The top two vote getters, if nobody gets above 50%, just goes into a runoff. Well, this would be party primaries where somebody would run in a party primary, and then there could be a runoff to determine who is the party nominee before you get to the general election. And I realize this is very technical and in the weeds, but the bottom line of it is we have in the Constitution a provision that says when a judgeship is vacant, it has to be filled within 12 months. And because of the way the closed primary system is structured, and because it will impact the Louisiana Supreme Court, there are scenarios where Supreme Court justices wouldn't be able to be elected in the 12-month time period. So this would change the timing provision in the Constitution to conform with the closed primary system. And see, this is all an explanation of why sometimes there are very legitimate questions about why have we put all of this level of detail in our Constitution over the years, because then it means people have to go back and figure out technical issues about how we elect judges and in what time period, and they have to go vote on. And arguably, I always tell people when I'm making presentations on the constitutional amendments, I generally apologize to voters sometimes because it's kind of unfair that they have to go through this process
Right.
and sift through all of this to make these very technical changes. Obviously, there are big issues that people put into the Constitution for a reason over the years, and so I'm not suggesting all constitutional amendments are arcane and sort of weedy, but a lot of them can be, and that just seems like voters have to do a lot of homework, and people have other things going on in their lives, so
Yeah.
it sometimes it seems like a lot to ask of people.
Well, Barry, I would think one of the things that Louisiana would not want to do is create more elections. I mean, for heaven's sakes, there's enough. It seems like there's an election around every corner in this state.
Well, yeah, and we used to have even more of them. I mean, I think the legislature over the years has kind of tried to, whittle that down, so we just have kind of a spring and a fall cycle for the most part. Although we still have special elections when you have, vacancies. I got an automatic light that goes off.
Hey, man, it's live stuff. It's okay.
Well,
You need to start waving your arms.
Very efficient. Um, But anyway, they're trying to whittle down those things, and so that we've got kind of two cycles. But we still have special elections, and there are vacancies and that type of thing. And the other thing is they're expensive. When the state has to put them up, you have to spend money to do that, print the ballots, to have all those folks go out, election workers, whether it's a big election or a small one. So, yeah, we don't really need probably to add any more elections. And I think that's one thing the legislature was trying to avoid with taking this route by just changing the Constitution instead of doing something that might create another election.
You're telling me that I've been in Louisiana like 10 years. You're telling me there used to be more elections than there are now?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Every time I turn around, it's another election. It's crazy.
It feels that way.
Huh? It does feel
It
that
does
way.
feel that way.
It definitely does. Melinda, where do folks get the pamphlet from PAR if they want to study up on these amendments?
It's at parlouisiana.org. It's on the front page of our website. There's a one-page explanation that summarizes for people who don't want to read 20 some odd pages of an amendment guide. And then there's a much longer version for people who kind of want to dive into details.
So it's parlouisiana.org.
Correct.
And Barry, just while we're giving out addresses here, what's your website?
Well, it's a new one, and I always have to go back and remember, but it's betterla.org. So like Better Louisiana, but betterla.org.
Betterla.org. Okay. All right. So let's look ahead now. We got a regular session coming up in March 14th, I think, or April 14th? April 14th.
April.
So what's going to be the big issue this time? I assume it's going to be insurance. Barry, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, I think insurance is obviously going to be there, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch because Tim Temple has recently been traveling again to London and meeting with the Lloyd's of London people and all that, and seems to have come back with a bunch of ideas and some proposals that he is interested in. Probably a long list that's going to have to be whittled down to some degree. But the legislators are really, I think concerned, especially about the auto insurance rates. If you recall, we had the session last year where we did the insurance issues, but they were focused, at least the ones that passed, basically on property insurance, and we'll see how those work. But the auto insurance, for a variety of reasons, mostly, political and kind of where the governor stood on one side of things versus, some of the legislators, that wasn't really addressed. But people are still concerned about the auto piece in particular. And so I think you're going to see a lot of legislation along those lines, and a lot of it's going to be the same kind of stuff that we've seen, kind of the tort issues in terms of litigation and that type of thing. So I think that one is going to be very interesting because it has risen to a real level of concern around the public, and legislators are feeling some of that heat. And we'll see what ends up happening. But as you know, this is a very, very political issue when you get into these litigation issues and attorneys and what you can sue for and bodily injury and all of those different things. So, yeah, we're going to have a big discussion about that.
I think one of the bills you're referring to was a Michael Mellorine bill from up here in Shreveport that the governor didn't like. Everybody else seemed to like it, but the governor didn't like it. I think he vetoed it, if I'm remembering correctly. Am I wrong? Somebody correct me on this, or do you guys remember as well?
I feel like that bill got bottled up in the Senate and didn't advance, but
Okay.
some iteration of it passed. And I know the governor did veto one of the tort reform bills that people had some issues with.
Yeah. How do you look for, or what are you looking forward to, Melinda? I mean, is this going to be the major focus, the auto insurance?
Well, I will say, just to remind everybody, this is a fiscal session, which means they can revisit tax issues, and they are limited. Each legislator can introduce an unlimited number of bills dealing with like the budget and taxes, but they are limited to five other bills on topics of statewide implication that are not related to financial issues. So there will be fewer bills than you get, in the other even numbered years when they can introduce a ton of stuff on every topic, but they do have some limits here. But I do think you're going to see another revisiting of the tax debate, because there are things that the Revenue Secretary Richard Nelson and other legislators who worked on the tax issues in the special session said they need to come and clean up, where they have conflicting language in bills that they were passing fairly quickly in the final hours, and they need to do some cleanup stuff there. They eliminated a couple different tax exemption programs that apparently they did not intend to eliminate, so they want to come back and discuss those. I think some legislators want to have another discussion on whether or not to charge sales taxes on services. That was a bill that got bottled up in the special session, and I think some people want to have that debate again. And then I'll just say, every session, the budget is a big issue. That money drives a lot of things and a lot of discussions in politics. That's no different at the Louisiana Capitol. And what happens in the March 29th election in terms of that Amendment 2, that has implications on whether or not they have additional money to spend in the budget that the legislature is going to craft. So I think a lot of legislators are waiting to see the outcome of that amendment to determine how much money they will have available to them. And then, there are always going to be discussions and debates about what to finance, what not to finance. There's a lot of uncertainty at the federal level in terms of how much federal money is going to continue to come to states. So I think that's going to be a running through line of the session is as states find out where things have been cut and where federal funding may be reduced. I mean, the legislature is going to have to deal with that. Louisiana's budget, about half of it is federal funding, primarily in the Medicaid program, but also in education programs, disaster recovery programs. So what's going on in Washington and those financial debates and what's happening, in the White House, all of that trickles down here. And so I think legislators are going to have to be watching that kind of stuff and figuring out how to work through their financial issues based on that. So I think that'll be an interesting discussion at the Capitol.
I'm glad you mentioned what's going on in the White House trickling down. I know Governor Landry has kind of instituted a state version of Doge, I guess. Barry, what are your thoughts on that and how that's going to work, or is working, or is it working?
Well, it's kind of hard to say right now. I mean, the biggest thing that's gotten attention is the fact that they were having meetings in private and not open to the public. And so that's really been the headline on that in terms of what they do. I mean, I will say you do hear lawmakers echoing kind of the same language that you hear at the federal level, talking about waste, fraud, and abuse and those types of things and trying to go after it. I noticed today I just saw where they added the legislative auditor to being a part of that panel. I think that's a good thing. He seemed to be interested in doing that. I think it's always good really to take a look at trying to do efficiencies. I think along these lines, one other issue that I think you're going to see that's kind of related is kind of maybe an attempt to reorganize or reform DOTD, the Department of Transportation. There's been a lot of scrutiny at that in recent years and a lot of concern about the size of that agency, the size of its budget, and trying to do something, perhaps it's going to be interesting to see what they end up coming up with. But something along the lines of, maybe privatizing some aspects of it. And that could, lead possibly to some reductions in force and that type of thing, which I won't compare it to what you're seeing at the federal level. I don't mean to do that at all. But it could be a very, mini version of kind of what you're seeing there in terms of a big reorganization of that agency. And that discussion has been going on for some time. And there have been some studies out recently that, kind of point to some inefficiencies there and some issues that need to be addressed. So we'll see on that one.
Melinda, you have any thoughts on that? The state version of Doge?
Well, I mean, I agree with Barry. It is never a bad idea to take a deep look into what the state does, the programs and services it provides, and whether or not those are still appropriate. Obviously, priorities change over time. You can always make government more efficient in specific ways. I guess from PAR's perspective, what I would say is we would like to see those meetings open to the public. I mean, the public, it's their tax dollars at work. We'd like to see them get input into what's happening, but we'd also just like to see that the conversations about efficiencies and improving the state fisc, that they are done in a public fashion so that people get to know what their government is doing. And so unfortunately, that's not how it started. We're still hopeful that will change over time. We've obviously seen some interest from the legislators and others to open up those meetings and talk about these things publicly. And so that's always a good idea. But the goal of what the governor has started, looking for efficiencies in government, is never a bad goal to have.
All right, listen, guys, I know it's hard to believe, but we've already gone 30 minutes. That's our time. In fact, we've gone past 30 minutes, just barely. I've got a whole bunch more stuff here on my pad that I wanted to ask you about, but we're going to have to save that for another time. But I really appreciate you all taking part today. Melinda DeLotte from PAR and Barry Irwin for Better Louisiana, right? Did I get that right? Just Better Louisiana. All right, yeah. Melinda, Barry, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
You bet. And thank you for watching the app. See you again next time.